I went on a strange journey this week. I was trying to get a simple, straight answer to one question. What is the actual state of higher education? I thought it'd be easy. I started with Pew Research. They reported very clearly 7 in 10 Americans now say the higher education system is generally going in the wrong direction. Oh, okay. Pretty definitive. Case closed. Right. But then I kept looking. I found a Gallup poll from just a few months earlier reporting that Americans' confidence in higher education has increased.
Right.
Right. So it's going in the wrong direction, but confidence is increasing. That's odd. But then Gallup also reported that the perceived importance of college has hit a new low. So confidence is up, but importance is down. Got it. Except another Gallup poll showed that the majority of U.S. parents prefer their child attend college, and another one showed that adult interest in enrolling remains high. At this point, my head was spinning. It's in the wrong direction, but trust is up, but importance is down, but parents still want it, and interest is high. It's a complete, total mess of contradictions. And what's fascinating isn't just the data, it's watching which one of those truths the media decides to grab and build their entire story on.
That's just a perfect snapshot, isn't it, of how information about higher ed gets filtered these days. You've really hit the nail on the head. There's this huge disconnect. The story we keep hearing in headlines, it feels completely detached from the full picture you get when you look at all the data together, behavior, attitudes, everything. So our mission, really, for this deep dive is to try and navigate through that mess you described. We need to look closely at this gap between the negative public mood, what people are actually doing, like enrolling, and how the media consistently seems to lean into this narrative of decline. It's about trying to separate that simple college is in crisis story from what's really going on, which is frankly a lot more complicated and maybe even more positive in some ways than we're led to believe.
Okay, yeah, let's definitely unpack that because the first thing that jumps out is just how widespread that negative story feels. It's almost like a given, isn't it? This idea that Americans are just losing faith in college. It's presented like, as we all know, before they even show you any numbers.
Oh, absolutely. That narrative has become journalistic shorthand, received wisdom. And it's really pushed by a particular way of reporting that seems drawn to, loss and failure. It makes for a better story, perhaps. If you look, major outlets, and the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they publish so many articles saying Americans have lost faith or are losing faith. But the trick is to see which data points they keep coming back to. These stories often lean really heavily on just a few specific findings, mostly from Gallup's long-running surveys, especially the ones from 2015, 2018, and 2023. Now, those polls are solid, they're valid measures, but how they get reported, that's where it gets tricky.
Right. I saw that cherry picking right away. Like that New York Times example you mentioned. They spotlighted that finding 24% of people think college is not too important. And they made a big deal about it being a 6-fold increase since 2010. That 24% number on its own, it sounds pretty alarming.
It's a classic move, isn't it? Shine a light on the scary statistic to suggest the whole system's crumbling. By focusing hard on that 24% who are really negative, they kind of brush past, or at least downplay, the other 3/4, 75% or more, who still think college is important or very important. It messes with the proportions. Yeah. The whole narrative gets shaped by that really negative slice, not the majority who are still positive, even if they have concerns.
And it gets even muddier when you see where else they pull evidence from. It's not just picking specific bits from good polls. Sometimes this whole crisis story seems propped up by surveys where the methodology is, let's just say it's a bit hazy, especially from companies that, might have other motives.
That's where you really need to put your skeptic hat on. You start seeing headlines pulled from sources that, let's be blunt, they're resume writing companies. Their methods often don't stand up to serious academic review. Firms like Resume Builder, Resume Genius, they have a business reason to get clicks, right? So they pump out these sensational headlines like 1 in 4 Gen Z workers regret college. And this stuff sometimes gets a surprising amount of play in the mainstream press, almost like it's treated as solid fact, because that crisis narrative is just so dominant. It seems like journalists sometimes go for the drama, the shock value, over the careful, maybe less exciting, but more accurate data. Because, let's face it, institutional failure often makes for a more compelling story than institutional complexity.
This feels like it goes beyond just biased reporting. It's actually starting to affect people's real-life decisions. That's what really hit me about that story, the anecdote about Maria.
Maria's story really brings the human element into focus, doesn't it? It's not just abstract numbers. Here's this 17-year-old in Virginia, totally passionate about art history, planning our whole future around it, a traditional liberal arts path. But her dad, and he means well, he works in finance, he's just bombarding her with these scary headlines. for months. And it's not just articles from the big papers. It's often those pieces sourced from, those resume companies we mentioned, or articles that only focus on the worst job outcomes for certain majors.
So Maria's whole future plan is suddenly up for debate at home. Her dad's pushing her hard towards something practical like cybersecurity or data analytics, all based on this panic narrative.
Exactly. Her passion, her chosen path, it's potentially being rerouted.
Yeah.
Not based on a full objective look at the pros and cons, which we'll get into the actual value data later, but based on this climate of fear that's been kind of manufactured or at least amplified by selective reporting. So the consequence isn't just academic debate for us. It's real families having really tough conversations, maybe making life-altering decisions based on incomplete information. It really makes you ask, what's the role of journalism here? Is it helping people understand a complex reality, or is it just feeding them the most frightening version of the story?
And this distortion, it carries right over into how we discuss enrollment numbers and dropouts, specifically the data from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, the NSCRC. We hear all the time about this huge group, some college no-credential folks, the SCNC population, and it's always framed as proof the system is failing.
That 43.1 million SCNC number is huge, no doubt. And yes, it gets used constantly to paint this picture of a massive dropout surge, proof that colleges are letting students down. But the narrative almost always leaves out a really key piece of context. The vast majority of those 43 million people, their experience is primarily with community colleges, the public two-year institutions, the ones mainly granting associate degrees. It's not primarily stemming from the traditional four-year universities that usually dominate those college crisis headlines.
Okay, hang on though. Even if it's mostly community colleges, isn't 43 million people starting but not finishing still a huge problem, a societal failure? Shouldn't we be worried that these two-year paths aren't leading to credentials? It still sounds like a major breakdown somewhere.
That's a fair challenge. Right. And yes, it absolutely is a societal concern. We need better pathways, better support, especially in workforce development and transfer systems. But framing it solely as a symptom of some sudden, deep crisis in the traditional four-year sector, that's where it's misleading. Because if you actually look at the other data points from NSCRC, the ones that don't fit the negative narrative, the story of collapse just doesn't hold up. The data actually shows surprising resilience.
Okay, let's lay those out, because if they challenge that collapse narrative, people need to hear them.
All right. First, the whole idea of plummeting enrollment. It's contradicted by a 3-year surge in undergraduates signing up. Freshman enrollment went up in fall 2022. Then, in fall 2023, overall undergraduate numbers grew for the first time since the pandemic hit, up 2.1%. You can get this. By fall 2024, total post-secondary enrollment wasn't just climbing, it actually bounced above pre-COVID levels. Freshman numbers alone jumped 5.5%. That's about 130,000 students. And a big chunk of that growth was driven by community colleges, which added 63,000 freshmen.
Wow. So the system is actually taking in more students now than before the pandemic, the very time we were told was the Great Reckoning.
That's what the numbers show. And then there's the dropout piece. Remember the SCNC group, the college no-credential folks? Well, the number of those SCNC students who are re-enrolling going back to finish has actually increased for the second year running. And what's more, the number of students who are stopping out, meaning they leave without finishing and don't immediately come back, that number has declined, also for the second year in a row. Now, if the system was truly collapsing, you'd expect to see stop-outs soaring and re-enrollments tanking, right? The data shows the exact opposite. So that collapse narrative, it seems largely built on leaving things out and twisting the context.
That really does set the stage perfectly for the next piece of this puzzle. If people's actual behavior is resilient, enrollment up, re-enrollment up, why does the feeling, the sentiment, stay so negative? Which brings us to that real head spinner, the paradox around institutional trust.
That's exactly. Let's move into that. Section 2, the institutional trust paradox and the partisan divide. The big mystery here is trying to square that high absolute confidence you mentioned right at the start, compared to other institutions, with this pervasive feeling that the whole system is heading the wrong direction.
But before we get lost in the contradictions, maybe we should just quickly ground ourselves in that baseline again. How did higher ed stack up against other institutions historically?
That's a really important point to keep in mind, absolutely. In just straight up public confidence in the quality of the institutions, higher education actually scores very well. It compares favorably against almost every other major institution in the U.S. That 2017 Pew survey you mentioned, It put colleges and universities right near the top, just behind religious organizations, I believe. And, this idea of controversy around higher ed, it's not new. We've literally been arguing about the purpose of college. Is it liberal arts? Is it job training since the 1600s. It's almost part of its DNA.
Okay, so debating its core value isn't new, but something definitely feels different now. It feels like the sense of crisis has ramped up recently. Less like a healthy debate, maybe, and more like a political fight.
That's exactly it. The thing that's really accelerated this feeling of crisis, it's the widening partisan gap, the political divide. That seems to be the single biggest factor driving this perceived drop in confidence. And the trend really started picking up steam even before 2016, but it definitely accelerated dramatically during and after the Trump presidency. So this trust paradox, at its heart, it's really a story about political polarization.
Let's look at that shift more closely. The numbers for Republicans specifically, they show a really stark divergence from how Democrats feel, right?
Oh, absolutely stark. Look at this. Back in 2017, only 36% of Republicans and GOP-leaning folks said higher ed had a positive effect on the country's direction. That's already quite low. But by July 2019, it dropped even further, down to 33%. Now compare that to Democrats and Democratic-leaning people. 67% of them had positive views in 2019. That's not just a small difference. It's a massive political split. So when the media says Americans are losing faith, a lot of the time what they're really reflecting is Republicans are losing faith. And that concern about cost is now tangled up with these cultural and ideological issues.
So what are those specific concerns that are driving that deep skepticism, especially among Republicans? We hear too liberal a lot. What does that actually break down to?
Well, when you ask people who lack confidence, they tend to cite four main things, and they're often linked. First, yes, cost. It's too expensive. That's a concern you hear across the political spectrum. But the next three are much more concentrated on the political right. Second, the idea that institutions are too liberal or too political. They see campuses as places pushing an agenda, not neutral learning zones. Third, there's a worry that universities aren't letting students think for themselves. This ties into fears about ideological conformity, maybe, especially around sensitive topics, race, gender, politics. And fourth, the feeling that the teaching isn't relevant enough. Now, that's an old critique of liberal arts, but now it often comes with an ideological edge, like practical skills are being ignored in favor of, say, political correctness. Those political and ideological worries, they're way more common among conservatives. It changes the cost debate into something like, why should I pay so much for something I fundamentally disagree with?
And this intense political split, this gridlock, it leads directly to the kind of paralysis that affects people trying to make policy, like David, the policy advisor in Pennsylvania. His situation seems to capture perfectly how hard it is to work when the data itself seems to be fighting.
David's story is a great illustration. He's working in Pennsylvania, right? A classic swing state, politically divided. He needs solid, consistent data to argue for long-term investments. So imagine this. July 2025, a Gallup poll comes out. It says public confidence in higher ed is actually rebounding. David thinks, okay, great, political cover. He starts drafting a proposal for a big state bond issue to reinvest in the state universities. He figures the timing is finally right. The mood is shifting.
He thinks he's got the green light based on the data, but then the rug gets pulled out from under him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just 3 months later, October 2025, Pew Research drops their report. And it says the opposite. 7 out of 10 Americans think higher education is heading in the wrong direction. So now David's standing in front of his state senator, basically holding 2 reports from highly respected sources that completely contradict each other. The senator, needing support from both sides of the aisle, throws up his hands and asks, so are we investing in something that's getting better or something that's failing?
And because the signals are crossed, confidence up, direction wrong, nothing happens. David's policy idea gets stuck.
Right. Any chance of stable long-term policy just dissolves. The conflicting data creates this informational gridlock. David's big bond proposal, it needed broad agreement. But now the opposition party can just point to the Pew data and argue, see, the public wants fundamental change, not just more money. Sure. So maybe they shift focus away from big investments towards smaller, less controversial workforce grants. It's safer, but it doesn't address the bigger picture. The media reports the latest poll headline, but the real damage is the breakdown in effective forward-looking policymaking.
This kind of conflict, this internal contradiction, it also helps make sense of that college trust paradox, the idea that's often compared to how people view Congress, hate the institution, but like your local guy.
That analogy is really helpful here, I think. We generally dislike Congress as an institution, the bickering, the gridlock, the spending. But polls often show we tend to approve of our own local representative, the one who, fixes potholes or helps with constituent problems. It seems to be similar with higher ed. Undergraduates, by and large, trust their own specific campus. Recent data showed something like 62% of current undergrads have high trust in the college they attend. But at the same time, a pretty big chunk, 36%, say their trust in higher education as a whole has actually gone down since they started college.
That suggests the day-to-day experience is okay, maybe even good. Their professors, their department, the campus vibe, that part's working. But the big national issues, the cost, the politics, the feeling of maybe bureaucratic bloat, those are souring them on the whole system.
That seems to be exactly it. The erosion of trust is happening at that broader system level. Those big national problems undermine faith, even if your personal local experience is positive. And that's a huge takeaway for college leaders. They really need to focus on delivering excellent constituent services, to borrow that political term. That means things like drastically improving career services, making advising accessible and politically neutral, really prioritizing mental health support. Those are the concrete things where a college delivers clear, undeniable value. It builds local loyalty, which might act as a kind of buffer against that often toxic national narrative.
Okay, so we've got a skewed narrative, polarized trust, but resilient behavior. Let's pivot now to the students themselves, because this is where the paradox gets even stranger, right? The huge drop in positive feelings about college didn't translate into an equally huge drop in students actually going.
Yes, this is really the third key piece of the puzzle. We're looking mainly at data from the College Board's high school graduation surveys, which tracks seniors from 2017 through 2023. And the standout finding is just how sharply positive views dropped, especially hitting that class of 2021. The ones graduating right in the thick of the pandemic disruption.
Just how sharp was that drop for the 2021 group?
It was massive, a drop of somewhere between 20 and 40 percentage points compared to before 2021. Let me give you some specifics. The share of high school seniors agreeing that a bachelor's degree is critical to future success, it fell off a cliff. From 87% in 2020 down to just 59% for the 2021 grads. And it barely budged after that, sitting at 58% in 2023. Similarly, belief that the funeral benefits outweigh current costs took a huge hit from 76% in 2020 down to 59% in 2021. Student belief in the job benefits also fell sharply, about 10 points right in that 2021 window. This was a generation finishing high school surrounded by uncertainty, and clearly many of them were seriously doubting the financial payoff of a four-year degree.
Okay, but if nearly 30% fewer students suddenly believe college is critical, you expect enrollment to just plummet, right?
Yeah.
But you're saying that's not what happened. That's the enrollment paradox.
It's completely counterintuitive, isn't it? Despite that huge dive in positive sentiment, the actual drop in enrollment among those same surveyed students was surprisingly small, just 2 or 3 percentage points lower. It's like the connection between saying you don't value college and actually not going just weakened significantly after the pandemic. Before 2020, if a student said a degree wasn't critical, they were indeed less likely to enroll. After 2021, that link got much fuzzier.
So why? Why are students saying, I'm not sure this is essential, but then enrolling anyway, almost like before? What does that tell us about how they see their options?
Well, it probably signals a couple of things. First, maybe that negative sentiment is less a fundamental rejection of education and more an expression of deep frustration or anxiety, especially about the cost. Second, it could suggest that even though there was more talk about alternatives, trade schools, coding boot camps, maybe jumping straight into a surprisingly hot job market right after COVID, students, or perhaps their families, still saw the four-year degree as the most reliable bet for long-term economic security, even if it felt frustratingly expensive. It's like the fear of missing out on future opportunities still outweigh the immediate worries about cost. Interestingly, the gap in enrollment rates between students who do hold positive views and those who don't has actually shrunk since 2021.
Now, this drop in positive feelings wasn't spread evenly across all students, was it? And that raises some serious equity concerns. We need to look at how this negative narrative might have hit traditionally underserved groups harder.
This is probably the most worrying part of the data, I think. Yes, the biggest drops in favorable views happened among students from traditionally underserved backgrounds. It significantly widened the perception gap after the pandemic. It seems like for students who maybe didn't have a strong family history of college going, that national panic narrative resonated more deeply, creating a bigger crisis of confidence. Look at the gap by race and ethnicity. In 2017, the difference in agreement about the value of a bachelor's degree across different racial and ethnic groups was pretty small, only about 4 percentage points.
But by 2023, that small gap had blown wide open.
Massively. By 2023, the gap was 22 percentage points. Asian students were still very positive, around 73% agreeing on the value. But for Native American students, agreement was down to 51%, and crucially, you see similar fanning out effects based on parents' education level. The drop in confidence was steepest for students whose parents had some college but didn't finish. Now, that's a group that personally understands the frustration of maybe having debt but no degree. They might be particularly sensitive to the negative narrative because they don't have that internal family story of guaranteed college success to fall back on.
So the negative story acts almost like a barrier, potentially discouraging the very students who might benefit most from the upward mobility a degree can offer.
That's the potential tragedy here, yes. When the national conversation about cost and value turns overwhelmingly negative, it seems the students with fewer resources or less inherited confidence in the system are the first ones to doubt its worth. And that just reinforces existing inequalities. And there's even a political geography to it. Sentiment dropped more sharply in states that tend to vote Republican in presidential elections. Which is interesting because before the pandemic, there wasn't really a difference in how students felt based on whether their state leaned Republican or Democrat. The political polarization of the whole system seems to be actively eroding confidence more in some places than others.
Okay, that compelling evidence of falling sentiment brings us right back to the usual suspect: cost. So now we need to really dig into that assumption that the sharp drop in good feelings lately is because costs are soaring and debt is out of control.
Exactly. This is section 4. Cost and value reality versus the lagging perception. The common wisdom, the easy explanation, is that this recent plunge in sentiment, especially from 2021 to 2023, must be a direct reaction to skyrocketing costs, crushing debt, and maybe shaky job prospects. But here's the kicker. If you look closely at the data for that specific period, those factors are actually unlikely to be the main drivers, because during that time, the data shows that net costs, average graduate debt, and the wage premium for having a degree were mostly stable, or even slightly declining. It suggests the perception of crisis might be lagging behind the actual financial reality for recent grads.
Right. The public discussion always seems fixated on the sticker price, that huge, scary tuition number listed on the website. Let's break down that perception versus what people actually pay.
That sticker price definitely causes sticker shock. And yes, it's true that published prices, especially at public four-year colleges, did roughly double in inflation-adjusted terms over the 30 years before 2017. People remember that climb, and they're right to be concerned about it. But, and this is the crucial point for understanding the recent sentiment drop during the period we're focused on, 2017 to 2023, average inflation-adjusted tuition prices actually leveled off or even declined slightly, depending on the type of college. So the prices stopped their rapid climb right around the time student sentiment took its biggest dive.
But the sticker price isn't the whole story. The real number is the net price, right? What students actually pay after all the grants and scholarships and aid.
The net price is the key. It's kind of the complicated, often hidden secret of how college finance works. And the data shows that for over a decade now, the average net tuition and fees, what students actually pay out of pocket or borrow, has been going down across all types of institutions. Public 2-year, public 4-year, and private 4-year. This is often because of something called tuition discounting. Colleges, especially private ones, might raise the official sticker price, but they also increase the amount of financial aid they give out from their own funds. So the average student ends up paying much less than that scary list price. What students were actually paying seems to have been moving in the opposite direction of that negative sentiment curve recently. It really suggests students are reacting emotionally to that high published price, even if it doesn't reflect what they or students like them are actually paying. It points to that lag effect, maybe reacting to decades of past increases, rather than the current financial reality.
That complexity also explains why that giant $1.7 trillion student loan debt number is so often misused when people talk about how recent graduates are feeling.
Oh, that $1.7 trillion figure is a huge distraction in this specific conversation. Yes, the total national student debt is massive, and it's a serious economic issue for the country. But that number includes everything. Decades of accumulated debt, loans taken out by graduate students who borrow much, much more than undergrads, and really importantly, debt held by people who started college but never finished, the ones who got stuck with debt but no degree to show for it. So that total debt pile isn't a good indicator of the financial situation or the confidence level of the average person who just finished their bachelor's degree.
So what is the debt reality for those folks who actually finished their bachelor's degrees during this recent period, say 2017 to 2023?
For recent bachelor's degree grads, the average amount they borrowed has actually gone down in recent years once you adjust for inflation. Two key things tell the story. First, fewer graduates are borrowing at all. The percentage who took out loans is down about 10 points compared to a decade ago. Second, for those who did borrow, the average amount they owe has also fallen compared to where it was around 2017-18. Among grads from the 2022-23 academic year who borrowed, the average debt was about $27,100 for public college grads and $33,800 for private college grads. Those numbers are still significant, don't get me wrong, but they are lower than the rhetoric often suggests, and they were declining during the period when sentiment was crashing. So you can't really explain that sharp drop in student confidence by pointing to a simultaneous increase in their average debt burden. The trend was going the other way.
Okay, and the last piece, the economic value. The wage premium. Is that falling apart? Is the degree worth less in the job market now?
Not according to the data. The economic payoff for a degree seems stable, strong, and maybe even increasing in some respects. If you look at early career workers, say ages 25 to 34, those with a 4-year degree consistently earn, on average, about 60% more than people with just a high school diploma. And that premium, that earnings advantage, has held pretty steady since around 2014. The job market clearly still values the credential quite highly. The data is really consistent on this. Education generally pays off, especially over the long haul.
So if net costs are stable or down, average grad debt is down, and the wage premium is holding strong. Why the terrible sentiment? This brings us back to Mike, the master electrician in Ohio. His story seems to perfectly capture this gap between the data and the feeling.
Mike really embodies that conflict, doesn't he? Publicly, he's the voice of college rejection. He echoes that decline in perceived importance we talked about. He'll talk loudly about college being a ripoff, say it's out of touch, both financially and maybe ideologically. And his frustration feels real. It's probably rooted in seeing those terrifying sticker prices and hearing the constant negative media narrative. He sees the big number and reacts with, understandable anger.
But underneath that public stance, his actions tell a completely different story about what he truly believes.
Exactly. His behavior totally contradicts his stated attitude. Turns out, he and his wife have been diligently putting money away for years into a $529 college savings plan for their son. Why? Because despite his public complaints, his actions show that high parental preference we saw in the polls. There's this deep down, maybe generational understanding that, push come to shove, a degree is still the most reliable path to economic security for his kid, so his negative sentiment. It seems to be mostly frustration with the system, the perceived unfairness of the price structure, maybe the politics around it. It's not actually rejection of the degree's underlying value or necessity. It suggests the crisis isn't really a value crisis. It's more like a profound price anxiety crisis, fueled by mistrust.
That's a really important way to frame it. It's not about whether college works, but whether people feel the system delivering it is fair and affordable. Okay, let's wrap up by looking at how students and parents feel about one of the most debated parts of that system. Admissions, especially the role of entrance exams like the SAT and ACT.
Yeah, the whole shift towards test-optional policies during the pandemic really ignited a huge national debate, didn't it? It touched on everything: fairness, equity, access, but public opinion on this. It's actually surprisingly unified against getting rid of the tests entirely. Despite all the controversy, nearly 80% of high school students and their parents think college entrance exams should still play some role in admissions either being optional or required. So the consensus is keep the tests around. But what's the preferred way to use them? Required for everyone, optional, or just not allowed at all? The strong preference is for flexibility. The majority definitely leans towards optional. About 70% of students and 57% of parents like the idea of test scores being optional. What that means is they want the test to be available. If you're a good test taker, great, submit your score, show your strength. But if you're not, or if you had a bad day, you shouldn't be forced to submit a score that doesn't reflect your ability. Only a pretty small minority, around 19% of students, 17% of parents think scores shouldn't be allowed in admissions at all.
What about the overall fairness of the admissions process itself? With all the stories about scandals and how complex it is, do people think it's fundamentally rigged?
Surprisingly, no. Most people seem to think it's basically fair, even if it's incredibly stressful. Majorities of both students, around 60%, and parents, 61%, actually believe the college admissions process is fair. Now, they also agree it's really difficult to navigate. 64% of students and 59% of parents said it was hard. But that suggests that while the process feels overwhelming, they generally still trust that the colleges themselves are evaluating the applications fairly in the end.
That's interesting. And which parts of the application do students and parents think give the most equal shot for everyone to show what they can do?
This finding kind of pushes back against some of the common criticisms you hear. Across different racial and ethnic groups, the things that students and parents most often point to as providing the most equal opportunity are high school GPA and scores on college entrance exams like the SAT or ACT. They seem to trust those more than things like legacy status, having parents who went there, extracurricular activities, or even recommendation letters as markers of equal opportunity.
Wait, standardized tests, which often get criticized because wealthier kids can afford test prep. Why would those rank high for providing equal opportunity, especially among some income groups?
It seems to boil down to a desire for objectivity and a level playing field, however imperfect. It turns out that lower and middle income parents are actually more likely than high income parents to say that entrance exam scores offer the most equal opportunity. The thinking seems to be pragmatic. The SAT, or ACT for all its flaws, is one standardized test. It allows their child's score to be compared directly against kids from much richer schools, schools with maybe inflated grades or fancy extracurriculars they can't afford. Things like legacy, amazing essays polished by consultants, unique summer programs, those often rely on money, time, or connections that lower-income families just don't have access to. So the test, even with its issues, is seen by some as this single, universal yardstick that offers a standardized way to compare students from very different backgrounds.
That's a really fascinating perspective on equity. Okay, so what about the reasons people prefer the test-optional approach? What's driving that preference?
For the test-optional supporters, it's mainly about fairness through flexibility and choice. They argue it lets students showcase their best selves. If you have a stellar GPA but test anxiety brings your score down, you shouldn't be penalized for that. They don't want a single test score to define a student's whole potential. So keep the option, but remove the requirement. Let students decide if the score helps their case or not. Now, on the flip side, the folks who prefer required testing, they often emphasize the need for comparability between applicants. They see the test as a necessary indicator of college readiness, maybe a sign of student effort, and really importantly, as creating that even playing field for admissions officers who are trying to compare applications from high schools with vastly different resources, grading scales, and course rigor. For them, getting rid of the test means getting rid of the only common national benchmark they have to work with.
And lastly, the small group who want tests banned entirely.
Their argument centers squarely on fairness and representation, but from the opposite angle. They believe the tests fundamentally misrepresent many students' abilities. They argue the tests are inherently unfair because resource gaps allow wealthier students to get extensive test prep, giving them an advantage. They feel the tests unfairly penalize students with lower scores, and that things like GPA, the rigor of courses taken, and teacher recommendations are much better predictors of actual college success. For this group, the test score isn't a helpful metric. It's an artificial hurdle that needs to be completely removed to achieve real equity in admissions.
Wow. Okay, we have definitely waded through a complete mess of contradictions today. From the media narrative versus enrollment reality to the deep political divides in trust and this disconnect between price anxiety and actual economic value. When you put it all together, what's the big takeaway? What should you, the listener, really hold on to from all this?
I think the clearest synthesis is this. The crisis in higher education we hear so much about. It's less a crisis of its fundamental economic value and much more a profound and frankly dangerous trust crisis. It's definitely fueled by very real anxiety about cost. But that anxiety gets amplified massively by partisan skepticism, especially on the right. And then the whole thing gets exaggerated by media coverage that often seems to choose conflict and simple narratives over the messy, complex truth. Because underneath all that noise, the basic human demand for what higher education offers that path to economic mobility, the better jobs, a degree still usually leads to that demand, remains incredibly strong. So the paradox we're wrestling with is that people, by and large, still seem to believe in the goal. They still see the value, the necessity of getting that credential, but they deeply mistrust or are deeply anxious about the vehicle, the institution itself, which seems too expensive, too polarized, too complicated.
And if we follow that thought through, maybe the real long-term danger to higher education isn't that people will suddenly reject it wholesale. It's not facing imminent collapse. Instead, the risk might be something slower, more like corrosion, a steady eating away of its legitimacy, driven by that widening gap between how unaffordable the system feels and the actual economic value that individual campuses still deliver. It suggests the public might only put up with the high perceived cost of that vehicle for as long as they absolutely trust it will get them to their desired economic destination.